All right, well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us again today for another A&A Money Talks presentation through our new eLearning Academy. We've added many new e-learning opportunities to our website. If you have not checked out money.org in the last couple of months, I highly recommend watching the recent presentations we have archived, as well as checking out some of our upcoming schedule events. During this presentation, you may come up with questions. If you do, please use the chat or Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send in your question, as all of our attendees are muted during this presentation. Your question will come to me and I will share the questions with the presenter at the end. If at the end of the presentation we're unable to get to all of the questions, I will send them to our presenter to answer. Toward the end of the presentation, I will be sending out a survey using the poll feature here in Zoom. Please answer each question honestly before leaving the room so that we can improve our presentations. The surveys will be shared anonymously with our presenter. Now, I would like to introduce you to our presenter for the day, Bill Ekberg, and his presentation, Artistry and Technology, How the Large Cent Dies Were Made. So this talk will use uses image analysis of early U.S. copper coins to show how the engravers produced the large cent dies. The U.S. Mint was an entirely new undertaking in 1792. Nobody who worked there during that time had any meaningful experience with coinage, and the technology they had was at least a century out of date in Europe. Nevertheless, by the spring of 1793, Chief Coiner Henry Voigt was creating hubs to produce the dies for circulating coinage. Robert Scot, first chief engraver, used hubs by Voigt and himself to produce new designs in the late 1700s. Scott's techniques persisted through the second chief engravership of William Kneass. Both Voigt and Scot produced highly artistic designs, despite the fact that neither had any die sinking experience prior to working at the Mint. In the early 1830s, Franklin Peale spent 2 years in Europe learning about the technologies in use there. The coins that Christian Gobrecht, third chief engraver, produced show how he applied several of these new methods to the creation of his dies. The coins tell us a great deal about how they were made. All we must do is listen to them. So our presenter, Bill Ekberg, was born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he began collecting coins as a Boy Scout. Coin collecting and photography were the first 2 merit badges he earned on his way to becoming an Eagle Scout. After graduating from Michigan and Michigan State, he lived in Northern Virginia from 1975 to 2011, where he worked as a professor of biology at Howard University, teaching and researching fertilization and early embryonic development. During the last dozen years of his career, he served as a department chairman and dean, and finally as an administrator at the National Science Foundation, retiring in 2011. He now lives in South Florida with his wife Susan and limits his research to numismatics. He reconnected with collecting in the late 1980s. He is a past president of EAC, or Early American Coppers, and is a contributing editor and regular contributor to the EAC journal Pennywise. For 7 years, he edited the Virginia Numismatist, the journal of the VNA, or Virginia Numismatic Association, and served as second vice president of the VNA. He is also a member of C4, or the Colonial Coin Collectors Club, FUN, Florida United Numismatists, the ANA, and the Rittenhouse Society. Bill, when you're ready, sir, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Sam. Welcome, everybody. I have to tell you before I start that we're in the middle of a heavy thunderstorm, and it is possible that we could lose power here, and I hope we will not. The talk is Artistry and Technology, How the Large Cent Dies Were Made. And everything that is done in the Mint in the production of coins involves technology, of course, even if it's hammered coinage. That's a level of technology. We're going to talk about the technology that the Mint used over the first 50 or so years that it was in operation. And we're also going to talk about the artistry of the engravers. This talk was going to be given at the Early American Coppers Convention in Pittsburgh, which was canceled because of COVID, and then merged with the ANA convention, and then that, of course, was canceled. So here we are. Very briefly, let's talk about numismatic evidence. How do we know what we know? There are basically two kinds of sources of information: secondary sources and primary sources. The secondary sources include books like the Red Book or any other book about coins, articles in the literature, articles in the Numismatist or any other journal, and mint directors' reports. Some people think mint directors' reports are primary sources, but they really aren't, because those are summaries of information of things that happened in the mint. So primary sources, first of all, contemporary mint records. And this booklet that you see on your screen is the Treasure of the Mint Receipts for Copper Coins. And every time the chief coiner gave copper coins to the treasurer, he recorded in this book just exactly how many and when and so on. And there's a lot of information about how metal moved within the mint in that document. And this is a page from essentially a day book that Henry Voigt, the chief coiner, kept. This is the entry for Thursday, April 4th, 1793. And if you look about 2/3 of the way down, you see Bay and York coining. Those are two guys that worked in the chief coiner's shop. And coining, this happens to be the day that they produced the very first wreath sets. And it's not just who did what, but also down at the bottom it says, paid George Link for 3 cords of wood, $8. So there's a lot of information in there. And of course, the other primary source is the coins themselves, and that's what we'll be talking mostly about today. So I want to talk a little bit about the methodology. There's the basic approach that I use in this study is to overlay one image upon another. And so what I'm doing here to illustrate with something that's familiar to everybody, 1909 VDB Lincoln cent and one from this year, 2020 Lincoln cent. And if we overlay these two, we can see what I've done here is layered one on top of the other and then adjusted the opacity so that you can actually see both. You can see that the dates don't exactly match. They're in slightly different places. Liberty and In God We Trust don't really match that well either. But Lincoln looks pretty much the same. To see the differences within Lincoln himself, I do these in different color channels. The 1909 is in green, the 2020 is in magenta. And if you're red-green colorblind, I apologize, this won't help you very much. But if we look down at Lincoln's shoulder, you can see VDB there, and most people know that VDB was added to Lincoln's shoulder in, I think, 1918. What this shows is that to do this, they actually made his shoulder larger. They actually brought Lincoln's shoulder down further. If you look at his cheekbone, you see there's a dark red line there. And if you look at the hollow behind his eye, you see another dark red line. Those are areas that are much stronger in the 2020 coin than in the 1909 coin. And if you look right in front of his eye, there's a little thin green line. His brow ridges were stronger in 1909 than they are now. And if you look at the hair, you can see lots and lots of red and lots of green. The hair is completely different on Lincoln cents today from what it was when they were new. And just to give you another glimpse, look at the hair and see how different it really is. So that's just a little information. How do we make a die? You can start with any of the 3 things on the left. You can start with a master die. A master die has the image in coos or below the surface. And there are no existing master dies from the early days of the US Mint. But this is a master die from, also called a matrix, from Spain, from Carlos II. This was from, I think, a 2 reale piece. And you can see that the image is carved below the surface. At the top, it's got the date, 1789, and at the bottom, Sepulveda, who is the engraver. So you use that master die to raise a hub. You pound a piece of steel into that master die to raise a hub. And again, there are no known hubs from the early days of the US Mint, but I found this. This is one of Louis XIV from France. And you can see that the image of him is raised. Everything else has been cut away. So this can be used to produce dies, or even to produce a new master die. You can make a master die from a hub, you can make a hub from a master die, and that's how mints mass produce dies. So the hub then impresses a working die, which has the image incus and facing the other way again. The working die will also have a center dot, which is the point of a compass that is used to scribe those 2 guidelines. You see those 2 circular guidelines. And those are there to control the placement of the text and the date. And notice that the text and the date are both backwards because they are going to strike the coin, which is on the right, and then everything will look the way you expect it to do. The guidelines are generally tooled off before the die is used. So you can begin either with a master die, you can begin with a hub, or you can directly make a working die. And the Mint certainly at least used master dies and working dies as starting points. We're not sure about hubs, but that's possible. So the Mint started work with very, very obsolete technology, as Sam said, technology that was at least 100 years out of date in Europe. Not only that, but no works of this kind requiring equal force and equal precision ever having been made in this country. Not only the whole machinery and all its parts, but all the tools necessary for their formation have been executed at the Mint. This is a report from Elias Boudinot to Congress in 1795. Boudinot was at that time a congressman, and he got himself appointed to a committee to get rid of the Mint because he couldn't understand why they weren't making enough coins and why the Mint was costing so much money. But he got religion when he went to the Mint and studied it, and he became such a supporter of the Mint that he later became the director of the Mint. Also in the same report, it was also a considerable time before an engraver could be engaged, during which the chief coiner was obliged to make the dies for himself. So who was the chief coiner? Henry Voigt. These are Chainsense. These are 2 of the 4 obverse dies that were used to strike Chainsense. People generally look at these and think of how these were handmade, and they were in fact completely hand engraved, as I'll show. But people think of these as very low relief coins. I want you to focus on the hair, particularly the one on the right. First of all, you're going to notice that it looks like every single hair has been engraved in there. You kind of wonder why he felt he needed to do that. But in addition, all those individual hairs are engraved on top of longer and larger waves of hair. It almost looks like Medusa with snakes coming out of her head. The coin on the left is the first Chainsense obverse die that was used. And you can again see lots and lots and lots of individual hairs, but you can also see masses of hair that those individual hairs were engraved on top of. Now, Voigt individually hand engraved each of these working dies. And we know from reports from professional engravers, including professional engravers who are active today, that it takes about a week to engrave a die. Takes about a week to engrave a head die, an obverse die. And so to make these 4 obverses and the 2 reverses that, that Voigt produced, it took him a good 4 weeks. Now the Chainsense were only in production for 2 weeks. Okay, takes him 4 weeks to make the dies, only 2 weeks to use them up. Obviously, hand engraving all the dies is too inefficient, and it's not something that can be continued. So here's the overlay of these. You can see the hairs are completely different. If you look at the truncation of the bust, they're different. The dates and the liberty are all different. And let's zoom in on the face, because that's the interesting part. The chins are aligned because that's what I did. That's the way I aligned the images. As you can see, the mouths are about the same. The noses are of different sizes and in different places. The eyes are in different places. The foreheads are in different places, and the throats are in different places. All of these were individually hand engraved. As I said, the chains were struck for only 2 weeks. This is a very famous passage that's quoted in a lot of coin books. I'll just read it. The American Sense says, a letter from Newark, do not answer our expectation. The chain on the reverse is but a bad omen for liberty, and liberty herself appears to be in a fright. May she not justly cry out in the words of the apostle, Alexander the coppersmith hath done me much harm. The Lord reward him according to his works. The part in italics is from the Bible. It's from 2 Timothy chapter 4, the 14th verse. Interesting that it talks about Alexander the coppersmith, because this is being critical of Alexander Hamilton, who was the the Secretary of the Treasury at that time. It's very interesting that this is critical of Hamilton, because Hamilton had nothing whatsoever to do with the mint. The mint was under the State Department, which was Thomas Jefferson's shop. So a lot of people say that this March 18th published letter was the reason that they quickly changed the design. It wasn't, because there wasn't enough time between March 18 and April 4 to have produced all the dies for the Wreath sense. So it wasn't changed due to complaints in the press. As I said, it took about a week to engrave each head die, and he made 4. It took a day to engrave each reverse die. Poor technology ended the chains, or at least inadequate technology ended the chains. It wasn't because people didn't like them. They only made 36,000 of them, and there were 45,000 people in Philadelphia. So most people probably never even saw one. Voigt then went on to produce the wreaths. This is an overlay of 2 different wreath scents called Sheldon 10 and Sheldon 11. The Sheldon 10 was struck in early to mid-April. Sheldon 11 was struck at the very, very end of June or the beginning of July. You can see pretty clearly, I think, that the faces are exactly the same. In the hair, you can see that there are large masses of hair that are pretty much the same for the 2 dies, but there are also lots of individual hairs that you can see in red and green. And what I've done here on the right is digitally remove the common elements. So all you see here are the individual hairs that were engraved in each die. So what Voigt did was he created a hub or a master die and created a hub from that, and used that hub to impress the working dies, and then engraved a whole bunch of hair on top of that. So here's what his hub looked like. You can see all the face, you can see the hair is soft, and only the masses of hair are in there. So this was not actually the first hub that Voigt produced. He had produced one in 1792 that he used to make the 1792 dime pattern, and then reused in 1793 to make the half cents. I'm not going to talk in more detail about that, but that was published in the Numismatist in 2017. Next, we have the heads of 93. Some people do not attribute this to Henry Voigt, but again, because Boudinot said until an engraver was hired, the chief coiner had to make the dies. So these are the famous heads of 93. These are considered to be some of the most important and most lovely designs that were produced in the early days of the mint. The one in 1790, or dated 1793, was made several months before the one dated 1794. And if we overlay those two, we see that basically everything is the same. They were obviously produced from the same hub. If you look closely at the cap, you can see that there are a couple of lines that were touched up in one of the dies, but these were made from the same hub, and that hub made all of the heads of 93. And that's what the hub looked like. So Robert Scot was the first chief coiner, or not chief engraver. He was hired in November of 1793 after all of the heads of 93 had been coined and released. But he created the head of 1794. And the question is, how did he do that? I know you can't read this, but this is a quasi-contemporary source. He wrote this to Congress to explain how he did his work. It's in his own hand from 1795. And here's an English translation. Before a die to strike money can be made, the previous step is to engrave an original one first. The original die is what we call a master die. The execution of that of the head of the cent will take 4 or 5 days. And if it is hardened with success, a hub, we usually say that now without 2 B's, is struck out of it. And again, this is Robert Scot writing to Congress. So he said he started by hand engraving a master die, but did he? And the answer is actually no, he didn't in the case of the cents. In the case of all the other denominations, he did start by engraving a master die by hand. But for the cents, he didn't have to do that. He created his master die for the head of 94 from Voigt's 1793 hub. Here we have the same 1794 head of 93 on the left that we looked at a minute ago. On the right is a Sheldon 21, which is supposed to be the very first head of 1794 that was produced. So these two coins were not too far apart in terms of when they were produced, but they sure don't look the same, particularly if you look at the hair of the head of 94, there's an awful lot more detail to it. I hope everybody can see that. But the general design is very similar. And if we do an overlay, the head of 93 is a Sheldon 19, and the Sheldon 21 is in red. The head of 93 is in green. And you can see that the faces, the eyes, the throats, the busts, the caps, basically everything is the same. The general shape of the hair is the same, but there's lots and lots and lots of red lines in the hair. That's because what Voigt did, or what Scot did rather, was punch the hub from 93 into the 1794 master die, and then he modified the hair in the master die, and he further modified it in each working die. And you can see that he sort of went crazy engraving each individual hair back into the die. So he pretty much went back to what Voigt had done the year before and then gotten away from, to just use softer masses of hair. Scot actually did engrave this one by hand. This is a Drake bust cent. There are two different styles of drape bust cent. This is the first from 1796. A very beautiful design. I think one of the better designs that we've ever had. And this is a little bit later version from 1802. They look pretty much alike, but if you look closely at the shoulder or the hair behind the shoulder, in 1802 you see there's a curl there that isn't present in the 1796 one. And if you look at the hairs behind the chin or the middle of the neck, you see that the curls there have been modified substantially. But otherwise, the heads look about the same. And if we do an overlay, sure enough, everything matches. Everything matches, except those minor little changes that I mentioned. On the lower left, you can see that new curl that has been added at the shoulder, and the other hairs there have been strengthened. And on the right, you can see those three curls have been strengthened. The one in the middle has actually been turned around so that it curls backwards now instead of frontwards like it did originally. And again, the hair is generally strengthened. So he produced his Style 2 master die from his Style 1 hub. Once again, he took an existing hub, used it to make a new master die, and then modified that master die to make a new design. So let's look at the cent and the half cent from that era. Those are shown in the proper relative sizes. The cent is that much larger than the half cent. What I'm going to do now is overlay the half cent and the cent, but I'm going to make the half cent larger so that the head is the same size as that on the cent. And you can see that the faces are exactly the same. The hair is almost the same. The hair ribbons, very, very similar. The bust is just about exactly the same. These two were done from the same drawing, and I'll talk about how he did that in a minute. I want to make the point here that Robert Scott was a really superior artist who did extremely precise work. These hubs were hand engraved, and he is able to replicate the cent the cent master die in the half cent extremely well. The man was very talented. If we read Walter Breen, he says that Scott not only had no talent, but he had no skill, and he was basically the worst thing that ever happened in mint. Breen was wrong. Breen was flat wrong. Here's $1.50 dime, again, shown to the proper relative sizes. Again, a beautiful, beautiful drape bust, the dollar and the half dime. They look a lot alike, don't they? And if we overlay, wow, almost exactly the same, even though the dollar is almost 7 times the surface area of a half dime. So Scott was able to replicate his design very, very accurately in coins that were of very, very different sizes. And here's how I did it, probably. This is a pantograph. You may have had one of these to play with when you were a kid. You trace a design, and it makes it larger or smaller depending on the length and angles of these individual arms in the pantograph. Pantographs have been around for hundreds of years, and they were not a new technology at the Mint, but they're one that the Mint used, and it used it to reproduce the artistry of the coins. So the next type of large cent is the classic head. I attribute this to Scott. Joseph Wright was also working at the Mint at that time, but he was Scott's assistant. His job was to work for Scott and do what Scott told him to do. So I'm attributing this design to Scott. He used just one hub for all of the classic heads from 1808 to 1816. The 1808 one is the very first coin of the type, the first variety of the type. And the 1814 dated one is the last variety of the type, and it was actually not struck until 1816, but that's a completely different story that I will be talking about in the Newman Numismatic Portal lectures at the end of this month. And here's the overlay. Once again, you can see everything is exactly the same: liberty, the head, the hair, the face, the bust. Of course, the stars and the dates are not the same because those were individually punched into each die. But the heads are the same because they came from the same hub. Okay, matron heads. These have usually been attributed to Scot, and they were attributed to Scot by Breen because he thought it was spectacularly ugly. Those were the words that he used. And he said it was too ugly to have been done by anybody but Scot. We, of course, now know that Scot was capable of great beauty. He made those draped busts. And so the notion that this isn't an attractive design does not by any means prove it was Scot's. And in fact, John Reich was going to leave the mint shortly after this because he said he was going blind. And this does maybe look like it was made by somebody whose eyesight was not the best. So are these two from the same master die? The faces look a lot alike, but if you look at the noses, the one on the 1834 is quite a bit larger than the one on the 1816. If you look at the chins, the 1834 has a very strong chin, sort of a lantern jaw. The one on the 1816 has a very, very weak chin and almost no jaw at all. But if we overlay these two, we find the hair, the coronet with liberty, the neck, the bust, the eye, the ear, and everything are exactly the same. So they were created from the same hub, or at least very, very similar, from the same master die rather. But if we look at the nose and the mouth, and we'll zoom in, you can see that the nose and the chin have been enlarged. And this was done by William Kneass, who was the second chief engraver of the mint, and he edited the master die in 1829 and 1832. So these are from the same master die, but it's been changed. Okay, this is Christian Gobrecht's young head. Gobrecht was the third chief engraver of the mint. Looks a lot like the other two that we just looked at. Got the same hair bands, the same liberty, similar face. But if we overlay that onto the 1834, we find that if we make the chin and the mouth match, nothing else does. The cornet's in a different place, the hair is in a different place, the neck is much thinner, the head looks much younger, the bust line is in a different place. So this is Gobrecht's effort at recreating Kneass's modified matron head design. Okay, this is Gobrecht's effort at recreating Kneass's modified matron head design. This is an overlay of 3 different years of Gobrecht's young head, 1835, 36, and 37. If you look at the dates, you can see that the dates don't match. The heads are exactly the same. They came from the same master die. The stars at first look like they're in exactly the same positions, but if you look closely at it, you can see they're just very close to the same positions. The stars were not in the master die or the hub. They were individually punched into each die, but they were punched in very precisely. And that red blob up at the top is actually a cud in the 1836 coin. It only shows in the color that the 1836 coin had in the overlay. So he then started playing with the designs. In 1837, he changed the hair cords by punching beads on top of them. You can see that the heads are exactly the same, except for the hair cords. And if you look at the overlay, you can see that these beads were just individually punched one at a time on top of the hair cords. Okay, now we come to 1839. I say fans of 39 with a Z because there is a group of people in early American coppers who call themselves the fans of 39. And they do that because this is a very interesting year because there are 5 different heads, all by Christian Gobrecht in 1839, and 3 of them are brand new. The first one, or at least the one we presume was first, is called the 1839/6. You can see that it's an overdate. It has plain hair cords. It shouldn't have been used in 1839. That design was gotten rid of in 1837, but somehow they resurrected it and used it for a few coins in 1839. The second type is what we would have expected, the beaded hair cords, otherwise the same as the previous one. You can see, if you look at this closely, how they use these dies forever. Tremendously extensive flow lines from dye erosion. The border is almost rotted away. They use this dye way too long. But that's characteristic of what the mint did in those days. So that's the second head type of 1839. The third is called the silly head. It's very similar to the others. The main difference or the most obvious difference is that you can see Liberty's shoulder. You can see Liberty's shoulder. The hair is behind her shoulder. This one is called the booby head. And these names, by the way, go back to at least the 1860s. So people have used these terms for a long, long, long time. Here, her shoulder protrudes back even further than the hair. And if you look at the beads in the hair cords, there's a bunch more beads than there were in the silly head. And then the last one, the last new head, is called the Petite Head. So all 5 of these heads were by Gobrecht. The silly head, the booby head, and the petite head were all brand new in that year. So why were there so many heads in 1839? All but the plain hair cord style are called transitional heads for reasons which will be apparent in a few minutes. There are no known directives from Congress or from the Mint administration to change the designs. So why did Gobrecht do it? I think he was experimenting with technology. In other words, he was using new technologies for his artistry, and we'll talk about that. There's 2 of them. The first one is called the Coinage à Portrait, or Portrait Lathe. This was purchased in France on Franklin Peale's recommendation. You remember at the beginning, Sam said that Franklin Peale had been sent to Europe to figure out what the European mints were doing that we were not doing. And he recommended the purchase of this. Also, a machine called a metal ruling machine by Christian Gobrecht that was modified later. Designed by Christian Gobrecht, modified and improved by Joseph Saxton, who was also somebody that Franklin Peale found in Europe. He's an American, but Franklin Peale found him in Europe. So here's Contamin's machine. I've never found an actual photograph of it. This is an engraving. It copies a relief image, reduces it to coin size. It only works for portraits. It could not do letters, stars, or anything with straight edges. If you look at the large disc on the top with the very, very pale or white disc in the middle of it, that would be the relief image that is being copied, and it is being copied onto a hub on that small disc to the left of it. As I said, this can't do anything with letters, stars, or anything with straight edges. It required a lot of hand finishing, but it could copy a die in a couple of hours. So it saved a great deal of time. This is the Gobrecht Saxton ruling machine. It copies a 3D object to a 2D surface, and it engraves 200 lines per inch, so it's very precise. These images come from a book by Jacob Eckfeldt and William E. Dubois from 1842, a manual of gold and silver coins of all nations struck within the past century, published by the Assay Office of the Mint. And these images are courtesy of the ANA, which has an original copy of the book, and they sent me very, very high resolution copies. The image on top is a bas-relief of the then new second US Mint that was sculpted originally by Christian Gobrecht and then scanned with this metal ruling machine to make this engraving. And the engraving was published in the book. On the bottom, you see a coin, and this coin is very interesting because it's an 1804 dollar. And 1842, when this book was published, was the first time anybody in American numismatics had ever heard of an 1804 dollar. And of course, everybody that had lots of money wanted one, and the mint started making them for sale. Here's an enlargement of it. You can see that the image is made up of parallel vertical lines, and the way it worked is that they had a tracing needle that traced these lines, and then a sculpting needle, a drawing needle, that engraved these lines into a copper plate. Now, they did not actually take a proof 1804 dollar and scratch it all over with a needle to produce this. What they did was they made electrotypes of all the coins that were going to be illustrated in the book and used those as the sources for these engravings. But you can see how precise this was and how it really gives a three-dimensional image of what's going on. Very, very fascinating tool. This is diagrams of Gobrecht's version and Saxton's version. Gobrecht's version has a horizontal tracer arm. Saxton's has a diagonal tracer arm. Otherwise, they're basically the same. And the reason for the difference is that Gobrecht's version distorted the image. It didn't give you a perfect copy of the original image. I don't understand the physics of why the diagonal tracer arm did give you that perfect image, but it did. These images came from this book by Arthur H. Fraser, Joseph Saxton, and his contributions to the metal ruling and photographic arts, published by the Smithsonian Institution Press. So how are these transitional heads done? Back to the coins. The arrows mark the changes that were made in going from the beaded hairs to the silly head. If we start at the top, we can see there's another lock of hair at the top, and the hair itself is engraved a little differently. Going counterclockwise, there's a big forelock that has been added. The position of the bust has been moved back. The tip of the bust has been moved back. And a couple of hairs have been removed at the shoulder. Now, when you engrave in a die or a master die, what you do is you make things bigger. You can't take metal away. I'm sorry, you can't add metal. You can only take it away. So if you engrave in a die or a master die, you make things bigger. If you engrave in a hub, you make them smaller. So the top two changes would have to have been done in a master die or a die. The lower two changes would have to have been done in a hub. But they wouldn't have to be. By the way, this is an enlargement to show you just exactly how precise this new design copies the original. Could not have been done by a contaminant lathe because the original model was coin size. Would require edits to both the hub and the master die. So it must have been a new master die cut to match the beaded hair cords in every respect. And pretty much the only way they could do that in one step is to trace the original design with Gobrecht Saxton's metal ruling machine. And that is what I believe they did. That new technology then was used in 1839. So here are the transitions from the silly to the booby head. And we'll start again at the top, or about 1 o'clock. You can see there's more hair been added at the top, going to counterclockwise, a larger forelock. Further, the neck has been made thinner. The bust line has been changed completely. The shoulder has been greatly expanded. The hair is a little different. And as I said, there are some extra beads that have been punched in. But again, liberty, the ear, the eye, a lot of stuff is just exactly the same. And once again, the technology in making this change was probably exactly the same as what was done to make the silly head. Again, the Gobrecht Saxton metal ruling machine. So who is this Joseph Saxton? This is a portrait of him, a photographic portrait of him by Matthew Brady's studio that's in the National Portrait Gallery. He was a charter member of the National Academy of Sciences, although he was not trained as a scientist. And what I love about this particular print of this picture is if you look at his hair at the top of his head, you look at the hair over his ear, you look at his mustache, you look at his beard just below his mouth, those have all been drawn in by a pencil. Brady's studio had no qualms about messing with their photographs. Excuse me. Joseph Saxton is also famous for having taken the very first photograph that was ever made in the United States, and this is it. It's a daguerreotype that was taken by Saxton through his window at the Mint. And one of those two buildings that he's taken a picture of is a school, and I don't recall what the other one is. But this is actually the view from Saxton's window in his office at the Mint. Okay, Gobrecht's braided hairs. This is the Petite Head. The general type is called braided hair. And these are the first copper cents to have been fully hubbed or created from the same hub and master die. This is an overlay of 1839, 41, and 43. And if you look, you can see the dates are completely different because those were individually punched. But the head, the stars, even the border beads match perfectly. This coin was made from a complete hub. And the reason they could do that is the Mint had gotten steam power. So they have much more powerful presses, much more powerful ability to produce things. And so this is the first copper coin that was produced from a complete hub. This is the mature head. This is a little bit later version, very similar. This is an overlay of 1847, 49, 51, and the so-called 1868 pattern. They resurrected that to make some coins to sell to collectors to make money in 1868. But you can see once again that everything other than the dates matches perfectly in here. So here are the petite and the mature heads side by side. How did he do that? How did Gobrecht do that? Did he just use different reductions from the contaminant lathe? The heads are in a little bit different positions. The petite head is smaller, but how did he do that? If we overlay them, looks not too bad, but if we zoom in, we see that liberty doesn't match, the eyes don't match, the ears don't match, the hair doesn't match. The reason is because the heads are of different sizes. Now, if we shrink down the mature head so that it's the same size as the petite head, now you can see that everything except the bottom, the bust and the hair below the bust, is exactly the same. Once again, this is exactly the same, made from the same model. The differences are that there is an extra lock of hair at the top that's been added in the mature head, and the bust has been moved down and back a little bit in the mature head. This is an interesting coin that was recently purchased by Rex Goldbaum, who wrote an article about it. This is an 1843 proof that Gobrecht used as a sketch pad, essentially, to lay out the design of his mature head. What you see, these little round circles with dot in the middle, are the positions where the new stars will be. If you look at the top of the head, you can see a line that's been engraved in there where the new hairline is going to be. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see where the new bust line is going to be. And we'll talk, and also if you look above the coronet, it looks like the coronet's going to be enlarged. If we layer that on top of the petite head, we see that, the mature head, we see that these are in fact the changes that were made, except that one above the coronet. He decided not to use that. Fascinating coin and very important. So let's end by talking about the half cent and the petite head. If we overlay the half cent and the petite head, they're similar, but they're not the same. Enlargement, you see liberties in different place. The beads are in different places. The face is pretty similar, but they're obviously not exactly the same. Most people think that the half cent was copied after the mature head, but this is the half cent and the mature head, and you can see that they're even more different. The petite head is more like the half cent, which is its contemporary, and that's back to the petite head. And the half cent is from a different contamen model based on the petite head. So to summarize, Gobrecht quite likely used the contamen lathe to cut the hubs for the braided hairs, but he edited the model before making the mature head master die and also before making the half cent master die. So new artists and new technologies greatly influenced die making, particularly in the 1839 to 43 period, but also throughout the entire time of the first Philadelphia Mint. And I'll be happy to entertain any questions. And if you want to contact me directly, that's my email address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. So folks, I'm going to be launching a survey right now. So please, it's a multiple choice survey. If you need to elaborate on one of your answers or have additional comments, please email them to Brianna Victor at seminars@money.org. So we did have a couple of questions that came through. I'll share them with you. I'm not sure if you're able to see those on your end, Bill.
I can't see the questions. No, you can read them.
Okay. So we have one presenter, or actually one attendee who asked, the font of your slides looks like actual Caslon, if it is, or is it? And if so, where did you get it?
It is not Caslon. This is, I believe that this one is called Fairfax Station, and it is designed to look like late 18th century type.
Nice.
And that's why I used it.
No, it worked. I loved it. So someone else asked that around 25 minutes into the session, was there a Sheldon 20? I'm not sure what day.
There was a Sheldon 20, yes. The Sheldon 20 is very, very much like the Sheldon 19. I did not have as good of a picture of a Sheldon 20 as I did of the Sheldon 19, and that's why I used the 19.
Nice. Okay.
They look to all intents and purposes the same.
Nice. So one person says that they're red-green color deficient. Thanks for that. What
I apologize for that.
Yeah. So they wanted to know, what app did you use to overlap the images, to do your overlays, and are they from your coins?
The over from my coins, I wish. No, most of those were finest knowns and coins that would cost much more than my house.
Oh, so they were Doug Bird's coins. Got it.
A couple of them were Doug Bird's coins, but most of them came, well, they came from other sources, but very expensive coins, definitely not mine. The program that I used for the overlays was Photoshop, and I do it in CMYK space, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, or key space. I find that works much easier for me than using red, green, and blue. The differences are more obvious, and I can control it better. The image where I removed the common elements, that was a program that is proprietary, and I own it, but I did not make it, and it's something that I had left over from my career as a scientist.
Oh, nice. So another question, of course, someone says, fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there enough details on the 1804 dollar depicted in the 1842 book to link to a surviving example today?
Well, it was one that was in the Mint's collection at the time. I honestly don't know. I'm not an expert on 1804 dollars for sure, and I don't know if you can tell the different original 1804 dollars apart. I mean, the Dexter one has a little D in the cloud, but that was added later.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, it may be one that eventually got some wear, so it wouldn't look the same today. But as I said, they used electrotypes to make those engravings because they would have damaged the coin if they'd used a real coin in the process.
Nice. Oh, nice. One person who I know, another EAC guy who will be presenting next week, Charles something or other, said, excellent presentation, eye-opening. So just thought I'd share that with you.
Thank you, Chuck. I have no idea who that is.
Yeah, some YN, I think. Another person, I know this guy, very prominent metal collector, asks, says, I can understand how a single hub can be used to produce multiple dies. How can one reproduce copies of a die using a master die?
Okay, you can't, you have to go from an image that's incus below the surface, like a die, to an image that's raised, like a coin or a hub. So if you take a plane, if you have a master die, you take a piece of softened steel and you press that down. In the old days, they used hammers. Now they use coinage presses. You squeeze that down into the image, and that gives you the raised, image on the hub. You then harden that. You harden it, and then you can use that to impress dies or even new master dies.
Nice. Yeah, it's a tricky process, hubbing.
I've seen them do that at the Mint, and they actually have very special, very, very powerful and very slow presses that they use for making hubs. They call it a process of squeezing, not a process of striking. And I've actually seen them do that at the Philadelphia Mint. It's very fascinating.
And then they have to temper them to make sure they're good enough to actually use for coining.
Well, not only that, but it completely distorts the cylinder because so much metal is moved that the whole cylinder ends up looking really weird, and they have to machine the whole thing down. It's a very complex process, very fascinating.
Nice. So one person says, in your extraordinary book on half cents in 2019, you also show some edge views. More to be learned there?
Okay, the edge ornamentation was originally put on coins to keep people from shaving the edge off to collect precious metal and make a little bit more money. It was basically a method of cheating. They originally used reeded edges on the gold coins and on the smaller silver coins. The copper coins and the larger silver coins all had lettered edges. Or originally in 1793, they had a vine and bars edge on the chains in the first wreaths, most wreaths actually. Again, the purpose of that was to prevent counterfeiting. The lettered edges were produced by a different type of press that was essentially two parallel bars, each of which had half of the inscription, and somebody turned a crank and the coin rotated between them, and that pressed the image into the edge of the coin. At the same time, it made the coin completely round, and it upset the rim so that the coin would stack better. So that was basically an early upsetting machine.
Yeah, the Castaigne
again, very interesting.
Castaigne mill.
Castaigne was the inventor of one particular flavor of that machine, but the U.S. Mint did not use his versions of it. The U.S. Mint made their own. So even though people call it a Castaigne press, it's not. It's like calling Puffs a Kleenex. Okay.
Yeah, the name
different brand.
Right.
Okay. Same general product, same purpose, but you're breaking copyright.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So one last thing that just came through the chat, and this should be fun to explain. Someone just wants to know, what's an electrotype?
Ah, very, very, very good.
You go to the British Museum; they have lots of them.
Oh, actually, they're a very collectible thing right now.
Yeah.
They were very, very popular back in the mid to late 1800s, but they could be made a lot longer ago. What you did, excuse me, what you did was you placed the coin in an electrolytic bath with copper, and you use the coin as one electrode, and then you have another electrode. And what you do is basically turn this whole thing into a battery, and you deposit copper on this second electrode, and it deposits in exactly the same shape and with the same three-dimensionality as the front surface of the coin. And then after you've done that, and it takes hours to get it right. I've never done it, but I've seen some. You then take it out, and then you have to do the same for the other side. And then you have very thin, very, very delicate shells, and you fill those with something hard to strengthen them, to support them, and then you can glue them together, and you make a coin out of it. The electrotypes that they used for making the book, I don't know for sure, but I would guess that they probably did not glue the two sides together, because why would they do that if they're just going to make a copy of each side independently? They maybe did, but I wouldn't think that they would have. But that's what an electrotype is, and those are very collectible, particularly the ones made by the Mint are extremely collectible right now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that'd be nice to get hands on one of those. I think we actually have a couple, maybe not the U.S. Mint ones, but I think we do have some electrotypes in our counterfeit detection set we use at summer seminar. But at any rate, Bill, I think those are about all the questions that came in. And folks, I know some people are still finishing up the survey. But Bill, I just want to thank you again so much for your time today. We have a certificate of appreciation that will be sending your way. Folks, thank you all very much for your time as well. Thanks for joining us. Please join us for our next presentation, 30 Minutes at the First Philadelphia Mint by Mark Borchardt on Friday, this Friday, August 21st at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. That'll be 4 p.m. on the East Coast. Brianna Victor will be hosting that presentation. If you would like to register for the next presentation, please visit money.org. Right there on the home screen, there's a big slider going across the screen that says ANA eLearning Academy. Click on that for more information for upcoming events, as well as the videos we've already archived. So again, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time at the ANA's eLearning Academy. Thanks again, Bill. Appreciate you, sir.
Thank you.